Hello guys, welcome or welcome back to my channel. So in today's video, we are going to be talking about the books that I think will help you get out of a reading slump if you are in one. Now, I do know that people experience the reading slump in many different ways. I know that some people will just not feel like reading at all. Like weeks will go by and they just have no desire to pick up a book or read it. I can't say that I've experienced that, if I'm gonna be honest. For me, what I define as a reading slump, or like when I think I am in a reading slump, is when a book just can't hold my attention. Like I read one chapter of it and then I find myself picking up my phone to like go on social media or whatever. And I will read like 10 pages and then I reward myself for reading those 10 pages by going on my phone. Whenever I catch myself doing that quite often, like I just can't seem to really get into a book or read a book because I just find myself like gravitating to go on my phone or do something else. That's kind of when I consider myself to be in a bit of a reading bookish slump. I'm not sure what kind of reading slump you guys experience. Let me know in the comments. I'm just gonna pick up the books in the order that I got them from my bookshelf, so this is not in a ranking sort of system by any means. The first book that I think is fantastic to get you out of a reading slump if you are in one is The Crimson Moth by Kristen Cicerelli. This is also called The Heartless Hunter in the US and potentially some other places, but for me it is called The Crimson Moth. This is a YA fantasy romance. I don't know about you guys, but I personally find YA just to read so much faster than like an adult fantasy romance. And I think because it's written in a way that doesn't have like a lot of backstory or like a lot of world building or just a lot of information dumping, which sometimes can maybe put you in a book slump just because your brain's absorbing so much information and you're like, I came here to relax. Why am I learning so much? I just feel like this book is really good if you are just wanting to kind of read a very immersive fantasy romance but not have to put in a lot of brain cells. Do you know what I mean? It's just such a fun book. It follows the story of a witch called Rune, and she is in hiding because the kind of world that they live in now hates witches. They want to kill all witches, burn them down. And there is a bit of an enemies to lovers fantasy romance element going on with our main guy Gideon, who is a witch hunter. I think that was really fun. You've got someone who despises witches, wants to kill and burn all witches, and then you've got a witch in hiding. It's just a really fun story. I absolutely loved it. I thought the writing was good. I was never ever bored reading this book. Not even for one like page was I bored. I was constantly interested and it just kept me very gripped. I just think this is a really good book to get you out of a book slump. Up next is unironically one of my favorite books of all time. I love this book. I can't even express how much I love this book. The second book that I will recommend if you are in a book slump is The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Guys, this book is so good. Like easily one of my favorite reading experiences I've had. I read this book about 4 years ago. It was just the beginning, I think over 4 years ago. It was like just the beginning of the COVID lockdown. So I think it was like April 2020. I also read this at a time when I was like not in my big reading sort of phase. I was only reading like a couple books a year kind of thing. Guys, I can't even express to you the chokehold this book had me in. I would wake up every morning being like, I need to read my book. What is gonna happen? Like I adored this book. This is a thriller slash mystery, so because of that element, it keeps you very gripped on the edge of your seat, wanting to find out more. It is also just such a fascinating story. It follows the story of Robert Langdon, who is a symbologist. So his job is to literally decipher symbols and codes and stuff like that. So it's so interesting in that regard. The story starts off in the Louvre, from what I can remember. So the Louvre in Paris. The curator of that museum is found murdered, and there's all these kind of signs and symbols around him. So our main guy, Robert Langdon, who is like a professor, a symbologist professor, is he? Yes, he is a Harvard professor. He is sort of summoned to this to kind of decipher what these codes mean, and that's kind of what's happening in this book. He is constantly deciphering codes and then moving on to the next thing and figuring it out. I wish I could read this book again for the first time, honest to God. The joy I had reading this book. If you are someone who's interested in art history, like Renaissance art history, Leonardo da Vinci's art, stuff like that, you will really love this book because while this is a work of fiction, a lot of the descriptions of the art and stuff like that in here are accurate. At the beginning of the book, Dan Brown says, all descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate. Such a fun book. Oh my god, honestly, please read it. Next book that I'm gonna recommend is either a you will love it or hate it book. You guys might know which book I'm talking about. The book that I'm talking about is none other than Magnolia Parks by Jessa Hastings. I ate this book up. Ate it up. This is just such a fun book to read. It follows a group of mid-20 something. Like 25, 24, I kind of forgot how old they were. And it's set in London, and this group of people are extremely wealthy, like the elite society of London. Like they've got money, and it just kind of follows their very messy relationship dynamics between each other, which is just really fun to read. You might not find it fun to read, but I found it very interesting. Pure entertainment. You know what I mean? It just follows very messy young people, but it's really fun to read about. Like I love their toxic sort of relationships. I just find it really fun. Sue me. I find it enjoyable. This book in particular focuses on two people, Magnolia and BJ. They're sort of like childhood best friends, turned to lovers, turned to kind of not enemies at all. They broke up and they're just not together anymore, and then they're sort of trying to find their way back to each other, but there's a lot of betrayal that happens in this book. It's just so interesting. This book had me absolutely hooked and I was eating it up. I also love Jessa Hastings' writing, and as the series continues on, the books get so much better and with a lot more depth. But the first one for sure is just very fun, very enjoyable, and very entertaining. Next, I'm going to be recommending a fantasy romance, and I've only read the first book in the series, so I need to finish the series. But it is Guild by Raven Kennedy. This is the first book in the Plated Prisoners series, and it's actually funny because I've heard that this series is so much better after the first one, but I loved the first one. I think I gave it a 4-star. This book is a King Midas reimagination. It follows our main girl. What the hell's her name? Oren? What is her name? Yes. So it follows our main girl, Oren, and she had been rescued by King Midas, and he turned her into gold. She can obviously, like, she's a normal person, but her skin is gold, and he keeps her in this gilded cage in his palace, sort of just there for him to kind of admire. But for her, she sort of developed like a bit of Stockholm syndrome towards him. He keeps her captive, but she admires him and she really likes him and she has a lot of affection towards him. Obviously just a very clear case of Stockholm syndrome, where because he sort of held her captive for so long and all she really knows is him, she likes him. There's kind of like a war happening in the background, and King Midas actually uses her to bargain something. So she sort of realizes like, oh, I actually don't really mean to him what he means to me. And then her sort of affection towards King Midas is challenged, and I'm not going to say anything to sort of spoil the book, but it's a really fast-paced book, really enjoyable. And I don't know if you can see, but the font was giant in this book, and because of that, it made me read it very fast. It just had me hooked. I definitely recommend this book, but it definitely has some scenes that I think if you are under 16, not for you. Moving on to The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. I absolutely adored this book. You can probably see I've tabbed it a lot. I definitely think this book is fantastic if you're in a reading slump, because the writing is very magical. When you are reading this book, you really do feel like you're just watching one of those early 2000s sort of Hallmark rom-com movies. Like, I just think the writing was so good. It was such a wonderful story. I loved everything about it. It is like a contemporary romance, but it does have a time travel element. It follows the story of Clementine, who is given her auntie's apartment. Her auntie has sadly passed away. This apartment is magical. It has a 7-year slip where it travels 7 years in the past. So she goes into her apartment one day and she meets this guy from 7 years ago, and they develop some sort of romance. I thought the romance was really sweet, but when she leaves her apartment, it doesn't happen all the time, just sometimes. She'll leave her apartment and then she'll come back and he's gone, because she's back in the present moment. But then she'll leave again and sometimes she'll come back and he'll be there again. But as soon as they leave the apartment, she can't find him. She can only see him in the apartment in the past. Look, I explained that so bad. I'm so sorry. Just please read this book. It's really fun. It's so cute. It's enjoyable. And it also has depth to it and just really fun, beautiful writing. Like, I loved it. Loved it. And I definitely think it will get you out of a reading slump if you are in one. And moving on to a classic series, which I'm not going to talk too much about because it's a very popular series, but you know, if you haven't yet read it and you are in a book slump, I do think this will get you out. It is the A Good Girl's Guide to Murder trilogy by Holly Jackson. And what more do you want when you're in a book slump? Full of plot twists, full of surprises, things constantly happen that keep you on the edge of your seat, wanting to flick the next page and find out more. I definitely do think like thrillers and mysteries are one of the best things to get you out of a slump, just because you are so desperate to find out what the major sort of plot twist is at the end, and you're like constantly flicking the pages like what's gonna happen. And because of that, you'll finish the book quite quickly. You'll be out of your book slump. The series is just so fun. You're solving murder mysteries, kind of like a true crime podcast. Just fantastic to get you out of a slump. The book I'm going to recommend next is actually a non-fiction, which is very surprising because I'm not someone who reads non-fiction, nor am I someone that thinks a non-fiction book would get you out of a book slump. If anything, that would put me in a book slump. Sorry to all my non-fiction lovers. It's just not a genre that I particularly find myself gravitating towards. However, this book, oh my god, is it amazing, and oh my god, will it get you out of a slump if you are in one, is Three Women by Lisa Taddeo. Picked this book up when I was at an airport. I was leaving Australia to come home to New Zealand, and I was like, I need a book. It's a 3-hour flight and I didn't have a book with me. So I walked over to the bookshop and I saw this book on this table with a lot of like other bestsellers, and I'd never ever seen this book before or heard of it before. I don't know if it's a very popular book. It definitely is. It's got praise from like Reese Witherspoon and Dolly Alderton and Jojo Mai, so it's definitely a very famous, popular book. But for some reason, I'd never seen it before until that very moment. I read the back of it and it just says, this is the story of 3 women. It also has praise saying the kind of bold, timely, once in a generation book that every house should have a copy of, and probably will before too long. Someone also said this book is as gripping as the most gripping thriller, but it's not a thriller. So I was like, what is this about? And I was really in the mood just to sit down and read a book on a plane and do nothing else. So I needed a book that was fast-paced and gripping, you know? So Lisa Taddeo, she is an author slash journalist, and she met up with 3 different women over the course of 8 years. So it says here she spent 8 years and thousands of hours listening to the women whose stories are in this book. She even moved to the towns where they live to better understand their lives. So she essentially kind of documented 3 different women's lives. And these 3 women range from different ages and are kind of going through their own sort of thing. But essentially what this book really is about is female desire and how women kind of operate. If you are a woman or if you're not a woman, I definitely think you would really enjoy this book. It is so fascinating. There's a lot of scenes in here that are quite sad, to be honest, and there's a lot of scenes that are just like so fascinating to read about. And yeah, I just really highly recommend this book. There's a line that was said in the beginning that often like me and my friends do discuss because it is fascinating when you really do think about it. One inheritance of living under the male gaze for centuries is that heterosexual women often look at another woman the way that a man would. It's definitely a book that I would read again, and I think I will read again, but it's also been turned into a TV show. I think it's on Prime, so I'll definitely have to check that out. I highly recommend this book. It is such a fantastic read. It's definitely good if you are in a book slump, or if you're new to reading, or if you're just looking for a good book to read. The next book I'm going to recommend is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This book I'm recommending in this kind of category just because it's so interesting that I think if you are in a book slump, you won't be, because you'll just be very fascinated to see how this book is going to pan out. I thought the premise of this book was so fascinating. It follows 2 best friends, Victor and Eli, well, best friends at the time. They're both doing their thesis. And so Victor decides to do his thesis on, I forgot what it was. It was something to do with adrenaline and how much a certain amount of adrenaline in the human body, like what that does to someone. And then Eli, the other best friend, there is like a bit of a rivalry sort of going on between the 2 best friends. And so the other best friend, Eli, he decides to do his thesis on extraordinary people. He's really fascinated by extraordinary people. There's been a few cases around where he's heard of them and people who just have this supernatural power. And he starts digging into it, being like, how do people gain this power? And he finds out they have survived a near-death experience. And it's the kind of near-death experience where you do actually die. you're dead long enough to be counted as dead in hospital records and stuff like that, but then you come back to life. So he found that those people that have survived those kind of incidents have gained an extraordinary power. So when Victor, who is the other best friend, hears about Eli's thesis plan and his idea, he is so envious of him for thinking that in the first place. He's like, fuck, why couldn't I think of that? And so he actually suggests to Eli, well, why don't we try this theory out ourselves? Why don't we find a way to essentially kill ourselves but bring ourselves back to life? And it's also done in a very scientific way that it is believable, to be honest. So that's what they end up doing. And you can probably guess it, they both end up developing some sort of supernatural power. And the story kind of goes off from there. However, it flips from the present to the past. So the past is when they're in university doing this. And then it flips to the present. And in the present, Eli is off being successful and stuff like that. And Victor is in prison. And he's just escaped prison and he is seeking revenge on Eli. And you'll find out why. But yeah, such a good book, so interesting, and I absolutely loved it. It was really interesting as well because they both have different views. Victor is very science-based, whereas Eli believes in God. And so it was really interesting to kind of see their opposing beliefs in this book. Next two books I'm gonna recommend I actually read on my Kindle. The 9th book is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This book is so good. Like, it's one of my favorite books of all time. I really want to read it again because I read it quite a few years ago. The reason I'm recommending this book if you are in a book slump is because the way that this book is kind of set up, like the format of it, is in an interview. So because it's like an interview format sort of book, it's all dialogue. Every single thing in that book is just dialogue. So there's no overly descriptive writing. There's no kind of boring sort of backstories or anything like that. Because it's all dialogue, I don't know about you guys, but reading dialogue for me is a lot more interesting than reading like the overly descriptive writing. Sometimes I like overly descriptive writing when I'm in a certain mood, but a lot of the times I do like my books to be filled with a lot of dialogue and like communication. Not always. Anyways, before I start thinking about my own likes and dislikes, this book is just really fun because it follows this band back in the 70s. Think Fleetwood Mac, or is it 60s? No, I think it's 70s. I forgot which decade it is. I'm pretty sure it's the 70s. So it follows the rise and the fall of this band, like one of the biggest bands at the time. And he's such a baby. Hello. You are the coziest little puppy. He's not a puppy, he's like 3 years old. Anyways, so this book, they're interviewing the band members and Daisy Jones, who used to not be a part of the band, but then she got involved with them. Interviewing them when they're much older, like much older. They're sort of reminiscing and looking back at the time when the band was on the rise and then what kind of happened for them to sort of all fall apart. And that is literally how the book is going. And yeah. Sorry. And yeah, it was so fascinating. I love this book. I gave it a 5-star, and I should definitely read it again because it's just such a good book. Taylor Jenkins Reid is such a phenomenal storyteller. Like, oh my god, she's so good. Oh god, my battery's gonna die in literally like a few minutes. Okay. The 10th book I'm gonna recommend is Spark of the Everflame by Penn Cole. This is the first book in the Kindred's Curse saga. It is a fantasy romance. I recently read this, and my god, was I hooked. I was so interested reading this book, which is why I'm recommending it if you are in a book slump and you're just looking for a book to pick you back up and get you out of it. Look no further. Spark of the Everflame was so interesting. It does have like world building and it does have backstory, but the way that the information is drip fed to you is done in a way that's really interesting. There definitely is like a slow burn, enemies to lovers, so if you are someone that can only read fantasy if there's romance, there definitely is romance. It hasn't really started yet, but you can see the sort of slow burn and the tension between them. They live in this world that is colonized by the gods, and so the world they live in is split up into two groups of people. So you have the descendants, who are like not the chosen ones, but like they're better than the mortals. The mortals are sort of like peasants, like they're kind of like The descendants descended from the gods, so they've got special powers and they're just like they're at the top of the food chain. Our main girl is a mortal, and the love interest is heir to the throne. So he is a descendant and very high up in the hierarchy. It's super fast paced, super gripping. Each chapter I was like, oh my god, I need to find out what's gonna happen. Like, it just kept getting better and better and better. And I've heard that as the series goes on, it just gets even better. So it's definitely one of those series that I think will just kind of keep you hooked and wanting to find out more and more. I'm gonna wrap this up because my battery is flashing at me and I'm really scared it's gonna die. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. Bye.